Hello, YouTube. welcome to our lovely college dorm. My name is Liam,
I'm Tommy.
and we are here today to discuss whether or not Jesus historically existed. Because, funny enough, we've both been looking into this recently, separately, independently, but parallel to each other.
Yep.
Tommy here doesn't think that. Oh, Tommy doesn't think that Jesus exists. Well, I do.
No, it's not that I don't think he exists. I'm just a little convinced or a little confused that he might not have, because I've been exploring the internet and I came across this American Atheists, very reliable source by a guy called Frank Zindler, and he's saying that, there's not much proof about the historical evidence of Jesus. And maybe although it's not in the burden of proof doesn't really lie with the atheists, he goes on to try to prove that he doesn't exist. And he suggests that maybe it's the Catholics or the believers that
need to prove that Jesus existed. Interesting. So Zindler, it seems, brings his views of religion as an atheist into whether or not Jesus historically existed. Is that correct? And he's suggesting that Catholics, as people who believe in Christ as the Savior, need to prove that Jesus exists in order to prove that their belief in God is valid.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, what exactly are some of the arguments which Zindler...
Well, this guy Zindler, he had a lot of issues, with the sources of Jesus, because a lot of it comes from the Bible, and as we know, the Bible is broken up into the Old and New Testament, and most of it's in the New Testament. And he just has some issue with, the reliability of the Gospels.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. I think that the Gospels need to be thought of in a historical context that's independent of our own. So with this being said, since the scientific revolution, we have been, conditioned by the society in which we live to look for natural explanations for the phenomena which take place in our world. Science can explain most things that to the ancients were unexplainable. So, with this being said, we need to understand the way in which the myth affected those who lived in illiterate oral society, and the way in which these supernatural ideas about the way that reality functions can influence the way in which, over the course of a couple decades, the oral stories that were told about Jesus could transform into something that were both historical and fictive, which I think it can be suggested that the Gospels are.
Mm-hmm. I guess that does lead into Zindler's point. He suggests that, Christ was said to have died around 30 AD, 33 AD, and the earliest Gospels were recorded till around 70 AD, the Gospel of Mark. So I guess this blackout period, causes some issue, but I think that could be kind of related. There's no reason, I don't think, for us to believe that the oral tradition, the passing down of knowledge without writing, I don't think there was anything wrong with that. There's no reason to believe that, it was being passed on in bad methods.
Sure. I guess with that being said, we need to keep in mind not only how miracles could explain the world to someone who lived in a pre-scientific society, but also how stories are passed down within a society in which people are primarily illiterate.
Mm-hmm.
So if we suggest that, what year did you say that Mark likely wrote his gospel?
It's believed to be 70 AD, I believe.
So 70 AD is roughly 4 decades after Jesus allegedly died. So this consideration, I think, also lends itself to the idea that the myth around which the story of Jesus was repeatedly told was one that could have changed over the course of tellings, and the amount of times in which the story of such a person that was on people's minds must have been told, must have been many.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in this book that I've been reading, The Jesus Legend, written by Paul Rhodes, Eddy, and Gregory A. Bird, they talk about how the early church teachers placed such an emphasis on how those who witnessed Jesus then went out into the world and spread his word, as well as how remembering Jesus' ministry was so important.
Mm-hmm. And with that being said, I know that the church, for the New Testament, I believe it's 20. There might be 27 different sections in it.
Yeah.
But those are considered the canon of the church. So they took the time, to go through the writings, because there's non-canonical accounts of Jesus that the church chose not to include in the Bible.
Sure.
So they did their due diligence there, and making sure that it wasn't stuff that people just been passing down that couldn't have been true.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
So, with that being said, is it safe to assume that the early church included gospels that they could consider to be canonical because of the way in which they historically represented Jesus, even if the miracles and the myth around which Jesus has come to exist may be looked at in a slightly fictive light?
Mm-hmm. I would say that's true, and I think that judging by the fact that I think the church has their full, puts their full faith and authority into the fact that the Gospels represent the historical figure of Jesus. I remember when I was researching for years back in college, when I was researching about a paper I was doing on the Christ myth theory. I remember coming across, I believe it was one of the Pope Benedict, I think. He was on statement at one of the councils of the church that saying that he believes, like full-heartedly believes, in his own book that he wrote about Jesus,
Sure.
that the Gospels represent the historical Jesus.
Sure.
So, Liam, how do you think we address the issue of, obviously there's 4 Gospels,
Yeah.
but not all 4 Gospels are the same. Some of them have similar stories, but a lot of them have different stories where maybe, say the Gospel of Mark has a story that isn't included in the 3 other Gospels, or 2 of them have the same story of Jesus, and when you think, they would have very similar accounts if Jesus was, historically existed.
Yeah. I think that this ties back into the whole question of the context over the oral tradition of Palestine at the time. So it's evident that the Gospels are an independent genre of literary works because of the way in which they twist historic truth with legends and myths and fictive truths that set to represent the story of Jesus in a particular way,
mm-hmm.
in an attempt to get a specific effect.
Mm-hmm.
So when the gospel writers originally were intending to write their works, they weren't intending for their works to be written as literature. They were writing the stories of Jesus, whether or not it was in a linear form or just stories of Jesus' teachings in such a way that that these stories could be retold and reproduced.
Mm-hmm.
And these stories are archetypical in such a way in which they stick in people's minds over the course of the past 2 millennia, as well as in the decades after Jesus' death.
Mm-hmm.
And the gospel writers wrote with the intention of writing down stories that could easily be orally reproduced.
Mm-hmm. That definitely makes sense. I mean, I feel like just by looking at the style of the Gospels themselves, they're definitely not, historical accounts of what was going on in Palestine at the time of Jesus' life. They definitely have, or the authors of the Gospel definitely felt the need to take some kind of literary license.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think something backing, the Gospels is the fact that there are accounts of Jesus that are written by those of the non-Christian faith.
Yeah.
There's one by Josephus and Tacitus. Although we know that Josephus is a famous, was he a famous Jewish, famous Jewish scholar, and but it is believed that his work has been, forged by later Christian writers.
Sure.
Who has come back and kind of embellished his account of Jesus. How do you think we can kind of handle this or respond to this as, the devout Catholics that we are?
Sure. I guess first we could call into question Josephus's respectability on other historical accounts, and whether or not we can remove the accounts by Josephus that look like they've later been edited. If we could edit those out and read what is independent of those as something that could have been written by a Jewish historian at the time as reliable, then I think that there's reason to suggest that Josephus did in fact write about a Jesus which he believed was someone who historically existed.
And in the case of Tacitus, I think it's believed by a lot of atheists, such as our friend Zindler, who's writing all that nonsense on his website, that Tacitus just got his information, from Christians, from a Christian evangelist trying to spread the good news of Jesus. So his account of Jesus isn't really an independent, source of Jesus that we could look at, instead of the Gospels.
Sure. Yeah, again, suggested in this wonderful resource that we found called The Jesus Legend, a case for the historical reliability of the synoptic Jesus tradition. It suggested that Tacitus would have noted a gray area regarding whether or not he believed that Jesus would existed based on his other works. And there's also reason to believe that Tacitus would have had access to Roman documents that have been lost with time that would have corroborated the evidence that Jesus did in fact historically exist.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess there is, there's always going to be gray area.
Yeah.
When it comes to oral tradition getting finally written down, and sources, ancient sources. But I think in response to what Zindler had to say, his argument seemed a little shallow.
They did seem shallow. Whether or not that there were scholars that perhaps stand on more respectable grounds than Zindler, whether or not there are scholars that try to take more objective stabs at disproving the existence of Jesus is something that we didn't really look into, but is something that could, stand in opposition to what we're saying. But we really believe that the burden of proof is on the shoulders of those who want to prove that the story of this man Jesus, how his influence gained such a rapid foothold in an area such as Palestine in the first century. What else could explain the way in which the myth that has transfused with the historic person, how else could it have happened other than that?
And just going off that, I feel like we really have no reason to kind of believe that the oral tradition that's being passed down, when it got written, it was done in bad methods, of record keeping or whatever.
As good as the time allowed.
So it is up to if you're going to call into question the Gospels as a reliable source, or Josephus or Tacitus, I feel like it's up to those who are saying those are unreliable sources. The burden of proof is in their hands.
I agree.
Cool.
Checkmate, atheists.
Checkmate.